this now.
Immersion is pretty messy. As it relates to games, it can mean all sorts of things. It's that feeling of being spirited away to a fantastical world, or it's the characters and stories you experience along the way, or it's simply that feeling of looking up at the clock and going, wait, what? Already? We so often hear about games being immersive experiences. This game is so immersive. This thing broke my immersion. But what does immersion really mean? What are we actually saying when we describe a game as immersive? When you're playing a game, you don't literally believe you've been transported to some otherworldly realm. Obviously, even if you lose all track of time and place, you're still aware on a subconscious level that you're just sitting there staring at a glowy rectangle. If that weren't the case, most of us would probably run away from danger rather than towards it. But we play games for hours at a time and relate our experiences in terms of things we experienced and things we did. And immersion is what we like to call this feeling of being sucked into another world while playing a game. The way some people talk about it, immersive seems like the highest honor a game can achieve. Everything should be done to make games more immersive, and should anything damage that immersion, well then you can kiss that recommendation goodbye. I like playing games, and the more I'm immersed in a game's world, the better, right? And the more realistic, the more immersive. Like all the graphics and bump maps all meshing together to make a totally believable world. That's the dream, baby! Well, no. Sorry to say, but that line of thinking is misguided. It's one thing to want nice visuals. I love playing a shiny new game with all the fanciest pixels. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Some games just wouldn't be the same with lessened graphics, and sometimes eye candy is all I'm really looking for. That's not the problem. The problem is the belief that this is where all games should go. That the goal of gaming as a medium is to create better and better simulations of reality until we're running around virtual worlds indistinguishable from the real thing. This is known as the Immersive Fallacy. In Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman's Rules of Play, the fallacy is described as follows. The Immersive Fallacy is the idea that the pleasure of a media experience lies in its ability to sensually transport the participant into an illusory simulated reality. According to the Immersive Fallacy, this reality is so complete that ideally the frame falls away so that the player truly believes that he or she is part of an imaginary world. Sure, there's a slippery slope at play. There's a stark contrast between the immersion of today's games and the artificial reality described in the Immersive Fallacy. But the trend exists today, and it's a worrying one. We've seen real-time rendering techniques improve drastically in our lifetimes, and consistent progression is to use that extra power to render increasingly accurate simulations of reality. Better reflections, clothing, hair, you name it. We keep edging closer to that perfectly simulated world, and today's VR headsets are just another step towards the wholly immersive fantasy presented by Star Trek's holodeck. We're on our way, it's just a matter of time, right? Well, the fallacy isn't just that games should strive to be these completely immersive experiences, but that these perfect simulations will just result in better games somehow. And that is simply untrue. 10 years ago, Frank Lantz delivered a rant at the Game Developers Conference regarding the Immersive Fallacy. In it, he talks about how there's a gap between reality and any representation of that reality. And behind the Immersive Fallacy is the drive to close that gap.
The problem with that is that this gap is an essential and important part of how representations work, of how they do their work. This gap is where the magic happens. And so, for example, let's say a bear is attacking a friend of yours and is about to kill them. And we have this word, the word bear, right? And you can shout out the word bear and warn your friend. And the word bear would not be better if it had teeth and could kill you. In fact, it would be much, much worse. It would be pointless.
There's no reason to believe eliminating the gap between representation and reality is a worthwhile endeavor. As Lantz describes, that gap is everything. That gap is what gives representation power. That gap is all the differences in how we each perceive the world. When you draw or paint or even take a photograph, you're not replacing our current reality. You're complementing it. You're reflecting on it. For those two to be one and the same eliminates everything that makes art, art. Lantz continues on from this point.
And even if you could, by some magic, create this impossible, perfect, simulated world, where would you be? You would need to stick a game in there. You would need to look down and make chess out of the little simulated rocks and shells in your world. And that it's like going back to square one.
The entire rant is only 6 minutes long and well worth your time. There's a link to it in the description below. The point is, creating a simulation isn't the same as designing a game. You can't just create an artificial reality, plop someone into it, and say, alright, go nuts. I mean, sure, maybe you could, and maybe they'd have fun running around for a while, but eventually they would need direction. They would need goals. They would need a game. Immersive doesn't mean interesting. It just means immersive. So if immersive doesn't mean interesting, what does it mean? What are we fundamentally saying when we call a game immersive? The immersive fallacy primarily deals with possibilities and futures, but there's a much more immediate problem with immersion. And that's how people actually use the term immersive. You see, gamers have an advanced vocabulary. Nope, no, not talking about that. Okay, no, I'm talking about the words we use to describe the games we play. We categorize games with terms like survival horror and roguelike likes and card-based action RPGs and however you feel like describing Mountain. Compare that to the way movies are commonly described, and you can see that we are a community that speaks with precision. Oh, no, you're detracting from my point. We have dozens and dozens of widely known tags we use to describe a game's mechanics, or camera, or story, or the way it handles time. These descriptors boil down to something specific and concrete. Immersive is one of these labels, but it shouldn't be. It doesn't really say anything. Say I walk up to you on the street and I tell you this amazing new game I've been playing is so immersive. What am I actually telling you? You can probably assume I'm talking about a 3D action-adventure game with real-time control of a character and, let's say, the occasional opportunity to stop and take in your surroundings? Although honestly, that's a bit of a stretch. Plenty of immersive games are 2D, or text-based, or turn-based. All you can really gather is I played it for extended periods of time. And there lies the heart of the problem. There's no one-size-fits-all definition of immersion. However, I do think we can break down most uses into two categories. Let's call them environmental immersion and mechanical immersion. Until I think of something better, I don't know. Environmental immersion is what most people are talking about when they call a game immersive. As the name would suggest, this is your environment, your setting. These are the aesthetics on top of the game that provide context and meaning. You're not just a square moving around some rectangles, you're an adventurer. You're not just ramming some gray polygons into some green polygons, you're saving a village. While technically superficial, the importance of context really cannot be understated. You can change the entire feeling of a game by simply swapping out a few textures and sound files. Being drawn in by environmental immersion means to be intrigued by the world and its inhabitants. You're driven to spend hours exploring the setting presented to you. This is similar to the way one might get lost in a good book or movie, so it's understandable that same logic would be applied to games. And on top of that, there's just a certain joy in exploring an environment in real time. Then there's the oft-overlooked other type of immersion, mechanical immersion. Getting immersed in a game's mechanics or its gameplay. Either through simplicity of design or player competency, the controller fades away, leaving nothing between the player and the game. You no longer think in terms of button inputs, but in terms of actions. You're not stopping to go, which button does that again? You're existing in the virtual space, using your senses to guide you and plan your next move. This is tied to psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's idea of a flow state, during which your skill and the challenge presented to you are perfectly matched. Not enough skill and too much challenge leads to anxiety, while excessive skill and too little challenge leads to boredom. The sweet spot in the middle is where you're grooving, you're immersed, you're in the zone, baby! Flow is a dense topic in its own right, but I figured it worth mentioning in case you wanted a Googleable term to learn more. Googleable. Mechanical immersion is harder to pin down than environmental immersion because it doesn't rely on a game's visuals. The visuals do contribute in terms of metaphor and feedback, but here it's less important why you're doing something. All you care is you have to do it, and you intend to do it well. While environmental immersion might apply to your Skyrims and Mass Effects and Bioshocks, mechanical immersion is the realm of Tetris, Guitar Hero, and Street Fighter. Of course, there's plenty of interaction between these two bubbles. Their Venn diagram is more like a snow globe thanks to the fact that it's pretty difficult to achieve environmental immersion without some form of mechanical immersion. You're gonna have a tough time exploring the world if you're constantly wrestling with the controls after all. But these two are frequently at odds as well. It's that feeling when a helper character interrupts the action to tell you something you already know, or when you have to wait for the okay to do an action you've been wanting to do for minutes. That's mechanical immersion taking a hit for the sake of storytelling. Put another way, mechanical immersion is broken when control is taken away from you, or your input results in an unexpected output. Environmental immersion is broken when something is inconsistent in the world, whether that be a difference between playable character and cutscene character, or a fourth wall break or something. Ultimately, the more barriers in between player and game, the less immersive. But sometimes those barriers can be used to great effect, so it's important to remember that more immersive does not inherently mean better. Because the Stanley Parable frequently breaks the fourth wall, does that mean it's worse than Gone Home or Dear Esther? Are the inclusion of cutscenes grounds for a harsher review from a critic? I don't think so. Thought of in this way, immersion simply becomes another tool at a developer's disposal. It's not the end-all be-all for a game's quality. As an aside, I think there's an interesting parallel between mechanical immersion and method acting. Method acting, of course, being the technique of an actor immersing themselves in a role, the goal being to act more spontaneously and emotionally true to the character. In An Actor Prepares, Konstantin Stanislavski writes, "The very best that can happen is to have the actor completely carried away by the play. Then, regardless of his own will, he lives the part, not noticing how he feels, not thinking about what he does, and it all moves of its own accord, subconsciously and intuitively." Of course, acting has a whole lot more to do with emotion and storytelling, and a whole lot less to do with running and gunning, but the underlying principles are similar. In these states of consciousness, we're existing within a fabricated space. The method actor isn't thinking about the stage and the lights, nor is the immersed gamer thinking about the buttons and the screen. They just are. However, what gives both their power is the understanding that they're engaged in play. The threat isn't real, therefore we're free to engage with this alternate world. I know I've kind of bounced around from topic to topic in this video, but at the very least, I hope I've given you something to chew on. Calling a game immersive isn't enough. If you think a certain game is immersive, go deeper. What is it that draws you into this game? If it's the world, what element of the world? What can and can't you do within it? Perhaps it's immersive because its controls are snappy and intuitive, and your hands are moving faster than you can even think. You should be as satisfied hearing a game described as immersive as you are hearing it described as fun. Alright, neat, now tell me more. And then there's the immersive fallacy, which is important to keep in mind, particularly during this current trend of VR headsets. VR can provide for a multitude of unique experiences, and the potential for mechanical and environmental immersion is great. But get excited about the games and experiences this technology enables. Not the idea that adding a treadmill and a haptic feedback suit and a wind machine is somehow going to make these existing games better. Games are made interesting by abstraction, simplification, and yes, simulation, but not by simulation alone. Losing yourself to a game is a wonderful thing, but understand what's happening when you feel immersed. Understand it to be the product of the game's design and controls, and don't corrupt it into this desire for a perfect simulation. It's understandable to look at a beautifully rendered 3D world and think, man, I'd love to be there. But you are there. You're playing that game. You're existing in that world. Enjoy it.